Welcome to Key Talking Points.
The podcast that makes learning effortless.
No fluff, no jargon, just clear, engaging explanations.
We break down complex topics so you don't have to.
Let's get straight to the point.
Visit keytalkingpoints.com for more. All right, so let's dive right in. Cappuccino. It's such a staple of coffee culture, isn't it? But get this, its origins go way back to, of all things, the robes of Capuchin monks. I mean, who would have thought monks would inspire the name of your morning coffee?
Right, and it's fascinating. The Capuchin friars wore robes that were this earthy brown colour with a white hood. And early coffee enthusiasts noticed that a bit of milk added to espresso created a shade that was almost identical. Hence, the name Cappuccino. It's one of those charming little links between food and culture.
Wait, so this wasn't always an Italian thing?
Not at first, no. It actually started in Vienna with something called the Cappuccino. This was actually black coffee mixed with cream and sometimes sugar or spices, kind of like a precursor to the cappuccino we know today. But it wasn't until the 20th century that Italy took that original concept and added their signature mark, the espresso and steamed milk mixture.
And that's where it gets exciting, because that marriage of espresso and milk really owes its existence to the invention of, you guessed it, the espresso machine.
Exactly. Angelo Moriondo created this early prototype in the late 1800s, but it wasn't until the early 20th century that advancements were made to include commercial machines. By the 1950s, they were producing that iconic creamer layer that we now associate with a proper espresso.
I love how these machines didn't just make coffee faster, they elevated it. Suddenly, you've got lattes, macchiatos, all these drinks that depend on that high-pressure extraction process. It's like coffee became art.
True, but it also created some, well, let's say, amusing cultural hiccups. For instance, if you visit Italy and simply ask for a latte, you won't get what you're expecting. You're just going to get a glass of warm milk.
No way.
Yes way. The full term is cafe latte. But American tourists, particularly in the 1980s when the drink was standardized in places like Seattle, just shortened it to latte. It's a small misunderstanding that stuck.
Okay, so lesson 1. Always specify cafe latte in Italy.
Definitely. And it's these little idiosyncrasies that make coffee culture so rich. Just think about how something as simple as coffee reflects broader traditions and values. Speaking of those unique traditions, one of the most fascinating aspects has to be the unwritten rules surrounding cappuccino. Like in Italy, for example, where you wouldn't dream of ordering one after breakfast. It's strictly a morning indulgence.
Really? Why is that? Does the cappuccino police come knocking on your door?
Not quite. It's more about tradition and digestion. Italians see milk-based drinks as heavy, something that should be avoided after a certain point in the day. They stick to espresso later on. It's sharper, cleaner, and a perfect post-meal pick-me-up.
So it's not just a drink, it's a lifestyle choice.
Exactly. And then there's the global influence, like Americans and their love for the cafe latte. Turns out, lattes were popularized to cater to American tastes for something milder and creamier than a traditional espresso. It's a perfect example of how cultural preferences shape what's served in the cup.
And speaking of culture clashes, let's talk about the flat white for a second. Australia or New Zealand? Who gets the credit?
The age-old debate. It's practically a national grudge match, isn't it? Australians claim Alan Preston coined the term in the 1980s when he literally advertised white coffee flat on his cafe menu. Meanwhile, New Zealanders say it came from Fraser McInnes, a barista who accidentally made a flat cappuccino and just rolled with it, calling it a flat white.
I love how something as small as foam, or lack of it, can spark international drama.
It's a bit ridiculous, but also amazing. That rivalry keeps the drink part of the coffee conversation, doesn't it? Plus, the flat white itself is kind of a middle ground. Less milk than a latte, smoother than a cappuccino. It's designed for people who want something just right.
Goldilocks coffee for the win.
Exactly. And speaking of coffee adaptations, the Americano probably has the best backstory of all. Picture this. It's World War II. American soldiers are stationed in Italy, and they just couldn't handle the intensity of espresso shots, so the local baristas added hot water to dilute it for them.
Wait. You're telling me the Americano exists because American soldiers couldn't deal with a proper espresso?
That's exactly what I'm saying. And to make it even more palatable, they'd often add milk and sugar. Over time, this watered-down version became its own thing, like the Americano we know today.
I kind of love that. A whole drink born out of necessity and, let's be honest, a bit of coffee culture shock.
It's a perfect example of how coffee evolves to meet the needs and tastes of the people drinking it. Every cup has a story, and sometimes it's a story of compromise.
Speaking of how coffee evolves, have you seen what's happening at barista competitions? These aren't just battles for the best foam artist, they're redefining how coffee is made and experienced altogether. Some of the techniques coming out of these events are downright groundbreaking.
Absolutely. They've definitely raised the bar, pun intended. These competitions have led to things like standardized brewing techniques and even inspired unique creations like the Greek Freddo Cappuccino. Have you ever tried one?
Oh, the cold one with that creamy foam. Yes, I had one on holiday. It was like summer in a cup. But it's more than just a drink, right? It's a snapshot of how global coffee culture influences what's served everywhere.
Exactly. It's also a perfect example of how local tastes reinvent classics. The Freddo Cappuccino takes the cappuccino idea but adapts it. In Greece, it's ideal for those hot afternoons, and it's been embraced far beyond its origin.
Speaking of reinventing classics, let's look at the supersized cappuccinos you see in, well, pretty much any big coffee chain these days. They're like, what, triple the original size?
At least, and don't forget the flavoured syrups. It's fascinating to see how customer demand has shifted cappuccinos from their more traditional form into these larger-than-life creations. But let's be honest, they're about as far from the original as you can get.
True, but it's fun to see how these modern versions cater to different palates. Like, your classic Italian barista might raise an eyebrow, but in the US or South Korea, those caramel or pumpkin spice versions are huge hits.
It's all about that balance between tradition and innovation. And while flavouring's part of it, let's not forget the role non-dairy milks have played in modern coffee culture. Options like oat, almond, and even pistachio milk are everywhere now.
Oat milk lattes are my go-to. But it's not just about variety. It's also about sustainability, right? The shift to plant-based milks reflects a growing awareness of environmental issues in coffee production.
Right, it's not just about what's in the cup, but how that cup gets to you. We're seeing a lot more focus on ethical sourcing, eco-friendly packaging, and practices like minimising food waste at coffee shops. It's a small step, but an important one for the planet.
And honestly, it makes you appreciate coffee even more. Every cup, whether it's steamed to perfection or iced and fancy, connects us to something bigger: history, community, even sustainability.
Exactly. It's a drink that's simple on the surface, but endlessly complex when you dig into it. And on that note, what a journey we've been on today.
Totally. From the Capuchin monks to modern baristas and everything in between, coffee, you've outdone yourself.
And on that caffeine-fueled note, we'll wrap it up. Here's to your next great cup. Wherever and however you enjoy it, thanks for joining us.
See you next time, coffee lovers.